ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to a brand new legal breaking reporting video analysis update in the morning edition of the morning report. Today's morning report, we have Benjamin Netanyahu's war. Let's get into it. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the latest news. California federal agents clashed with protesters during an immigration raid at a cannabis farm. Agents fired crowd control demonstrators threw objects at their vehicles. See video below. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to that in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to tariffs. Trump threatened to impose a 35% tariff on Canada imports from August 1st, upending trade talks. Federal employees, ladies and gentlemen. The State Department told workers that it was about to begin layoffs 2 days after the Supreme Court allowed the regime to slash the federal workforce. We have more on those stories below. But first, we talk to one of the journalists, and let's hear what they have to say behind a major news story about Benjamin Netanyahu. Ladies and gentlemen, Netanyahu's war. Why has the Gaza war lasted so long? In a blockbuster investigative profile that was published this morning, the Times magazine explains how Benjamin Netanyahu prolonged it partly for personal political reasons. A journalist, Jerusalem Bureau Chief Patrick Kinsley and his colleagues Roman Bergman and Nathan Odenhelm spent 6 months interviewing more than 110 people and reviewing scores of military and government documents. Patrick was spoke to, who is leaving his role this summer after 4.5 years in what many have called the hardest job in journalism about Netanyahu, the war, and how they got to got people to share so many secrets. Today is the 643rd day since the October 7 attack. Nobody imagined, ladies and gentlemen, the war would go on this long. Why is it still going on? The strategic argument was that it gave Israel a better chance of defeating not only Hamas, but also Hamas's regional allies, Hezbollah, Hezbollah, and Iran. Whether you buy that argument or not, our reporting shows that Netanyahu was clearly often motivated by his personal interests instead of only by these national priorities. There were key turning points when Netanyahu chose to continue the war to prevent the collapse of his coalition government. Fearing a domestic backlash, Netanyahu also refused to finalize a clear post-war plan for Gaza, leading to an aimless battlefield strategy that killed tens of thousands, stained Israel's reputation, and still allowed Hamas to survive. Ladies and gentlemen, the article opens on a remarkable scene at an April 2024 cabinet meeting. A truce was on the table, almost. What happened to it? You guys may be asking. Well, after months of stalling, Netanyahu had softened his negotiating position, raising the chances of a ceasefire and hostage release deal. His aides were preparing to present this new position to government ministers. Then a hard-right minister threatened to bring down the government if the deal went ahead. Netanyahu chose to continue the war rather than see his government collapse. Ronan and Nathan uncovered so many things that have never been reported before. People should read the whole story, but can you tease them here with a few of the most telling tidbits? But yeah, There's a moment in a hospital when Netanyahu was in pajamas after being fitted with a pacemaker, and a security chief called to warn him of a looming attack. There's a phone call minutes into the October 7 attack when he first learned about the scale of the raid. There's the attempt by his team to alter the official record of that phone call. There's a surprise appearance by the Saudi crown prince. Crown prince. Fraught conversations between Netanyahu and President Joe Biden, and a decisive meeting where he tells the military leadership to bomb Gaza with even more intensity. When Netanyahu was covered a decade ago, he was universally assessed as risk averse, letting conflicts simmer rather than embark on all-out wars like the ones we've seen the last 2 years. What changed? In some senses, he is still the same Netanyahu that you knew. He still keeps a lot of options open, avoiding key decisions until the last moment. We see that in his months-long deferral of all-out confrontation with with Hezbollah, Hezbollah, and Iran last year. But he has gradually taken more risks. He ultimately did choose to invade Lebanon, assassinate Hezbollah's leadership, Hezbollah, invade Syria, and brazenly bombard Iran. These choices are partly about a shift in the Israeli psyche, psyche, to Israel's critics. The Hamas attack was an inevitable reaction to Israel's blockade of Gaza and occupation of the West Bank. But to many Israelis, the attack was the result of Israel's timidity, its failure to deal preemptively with the threat that Hamas posed. Our colleagues wrote recently that Israel has managed over the last 2 years to vanquish its enemies, but also eliminate friends. What does there portend for its future? what does that portend for their future? In diplomatic terms, Israel has a foot in two parallel realities. In the first, Israel's global standing has rarely been lower. In the second, Israel is edging closer to breakthrough, with longtime foes defying the logic that the war in Gaza has left irrevocably isolated. Left it irrevocably isolated, even as Israel's reputation worsens within American and Arab societies. Israelis' envoys are simultaneously engaged in back-channel talks with the officials in Syria that could firm up Israel's standard in the Middle East. It's a bizarre and confusing situation. Netanyahu is 75 and Israel's longest tenured prime minister, serving nearly 18 years in 3 stints. Yet there is no hint of him being ready to retire. A few longtime Netanyahu watchers think he might bow out if he establishes formal ties with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states. Coupled with the Iran campaign, he might then have secured enough military and diplomatic triumphs to restore his diplomatic legacy, even as his global reputation is in tatters. But for years, Netanyahu has refused to resign despite being prosecuted for corruption, a change he denies. He has not given the impression of ever wanting to call it a day. You can read the full story here, ladies and gentlemen. I will have a link to that in the video description. For now, more on the Middle East. Some of Israel's near-bomb grade uranium survived American and Israeli strikes last month. An Israeli official said an Israeli airstrike near a health clinic in Gaza killed more than a dozen people, according to the hospital that received many of the dead. Israel agreed to let humanitarian aid into Gaza after discussion with the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the latest news on trade. As justification for his threatened tariffs on Canada, Trump repeated discredited claims about the flow of fentanyl across the U.S.-Canada border. For months, the son of the former Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro, pressed the U.S. to sanction the judge prosecuting his father by threatening harsh tariffs on Brazil. Trump opted for something bigger. About the president's powers over trade. Government agencies, ladies and gentlemen, the FBI has polygraphs to test its employees' loyalty. It asked some senior officials if they had said anything negative about the Bureau's Director Kash Patel. The Secret Service, ladies and gentlemen, said it would suggest 6 agents involved in securing the site of a rally where a gunman tried to assassinate Trump last summer. Under the State Department's plan to lay off workers, the agency's U.S.-based workforce will shrink by about 15%. The Justice Department issued subpoenas demanding confidential patient information from doctors and hospitals that provide gender-related treatments to minors. A whistleblower accused the Justice Department of pressuring lawyers to ignore judges and the due process rights of migrants, according to what he told The Times. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to immigration. Trump has given California farmers mixed messages on immigration raids. Farmers were worry they won't have enough workers to pick plums, peaches, and apricots before they rot. A federal court blocked the Trump regime from enforcing its executive order ending birthright citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's get to the Texas floods. Officials in Kerr County, Texas, where recent floods killed dozens, tried for years to secure funding for a flood alarm. The Times found the wannabe dictator and Melania are expected today to tour areas of central Texas devastated by flooding. Ladies and gentlemen, your pick. The most clicked article in the morning yesterday was about what happened after floodwaters engulfed a 60-room inn along the Guadalupe River. In a video, Judson Jones, who's a Times meteorologist and reporter, explains why catastrophe struck Central Texas despite a series of warnings from the National Weather Service. Click below. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have that in the I will have the video in the video description. International, ladies and gentlemen, unregulated rare earth mining in Myanmar, directed by Chinese enterprises, is poisoning rivers that flow through Thailand. Archaeologists unearthed the 1,700-year-old tomb of a Maya ruler in Belize. They found a rare mosaic, MOSAIC, death mask, and elaborate jewelry buried with his body. Ladies and gentlemen, other big stories. 27 workers escaped a collapsed tunnel in Los Angeles, emerging 5 miles away without major injury. A Minnesota sheriff said he had no idea his deputies were assaulting people brutally. He knew the entire time, a Times investigation found. Ladies and gentlemen, in one chart. Yesterday, NVIDIA became the first public company worth $4 trillion. It reached this milestone before many better known tech giants include Apple and Microsoft. Read more about NVIDIA's NVIDIA''S rise, its control over the AI chip market, and what competition it faces in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to that in the video description. Moving on to opinions, ladies and gentlemen. Planning codes often encourage new high-rises, but as the world gets better, we need the showdown, ladies and gentlemen. They call Sam Bloch argues. They cast. Planning codes often discourage new high rises, but as the world gets hotter, we need the showdown they cast. Sam argues. Here's The Columnist by David Brooks on the fall of literacy fiction. literary fiction, and ZZEY, NAP, N-A-P. Tufeci, Tufeci, on chatbots. Everything the Times offers, all in one subscription. Morning readers save unlimited access to Times with this introductory offer. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to the introductory offer in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, morning reads. 36 hours in Brazil's take in a masterpiece of Belgian Baroque, Baroque architecture, and delve into the country's best history. Nantucket, a majority of the Israel's housing units are occupied by several seasoned residents. That leaves teachers and police officers to live in substandard housing. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to rental cars. Hertz is increasingly relying on AI scanners to flag even tiny dings. Ladies and gentlemen, customers aren't happy. Ladies and gentlemen, lives lived. The keyboardist Dave "Baby" Cortez reached number 1 on the Billboard singles chart in 1959, but his stardom was short-lived. Aside from a brief comeback in 2011, he largely abandoned music and dropped out of sight. In recent weeks, it was discovered that he had died in 2022 at the age of 83 and was buried in an unmarked grave. Ladies and gentlemen, time for sports. Wimbledon. Amanda Anisimova, Anisimova, became the first American since Serena Williams in 2019 to reach a Wimbledon final after upsetting world number 1 Aryna Sabalenka Sabalenka. NBA Cooper Flag had an uneven performance against Bronny James and the Lakers in his summer league debut, but he still showed flashes of why the Mavericks made him the number 1 pick in the draft. Maverics. Ladies and gentlemen, arts and ideas. Few opera goers wear tuxedos or elbow-length clothes to performances anymore, as venues court younger patrons. They've found themselves in a bind, keep dress codes or risk losing some of the old world charm. But for La Scala, Milan's storied opera house, tank tops and shorts went too far. Ladies and gentlemen, more on culture. In Paris, the original Hermes Birkin bag, designed for the actress Jane Birkin, sold at auction for more than $10 million. Ladies and gentlemen, trending. Justin Bieber unexpectedly dropped Swag, his first album in 4 years. Rolling Stone reports on his late-night show, Fox News' Greg Gutfeld joked about Biden's doctor. The Morning recommends, ladies and gentlemen, make a famous Kakio peep, keep houseplants alive while you're away. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to all these in the video description. And to take their survey quiz. Moving on to games, ladies and gentlemen. Here's today's spelling bee. Yesterday's pangrams was implement. And here are today's mini crossword Wordle connections, sports and connections and strands. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for spending part of your morning with the Times. See you tomorrow. Sign up here to get this news in your inbox. Reach the New York Times team at themorning@newyorktimes.com.